Hi, I'm Rachel. At my sister-in-law's baby shower, they handed me an apron and pointed toward the kitchen like I was the hired help. My mother-in-law actually told the other guests I was David's little court clerk wife who knows her place around successful people. What she didn't know was that in 18 hours I'd be signing the federal seizure order for their $12. $3 million empire. The same hands they watched scrub their dishes would be the ones putting their assets in government custody. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about the moment you realize that being underestimated isn't always a weakness. Sometimes it's the perfect cover for justice. And when people treat you like you're invisible, they forget that invisible people see everything. 3 years ago, I married David Chen, and I thought I was gaining a family. What I got instead was a part-time job as their unpaid domestic staff. David's wonderful, don't get me wrong. He works in cybersecurity for a tech firm in Phoenix, keeps his head down, pays his taxes, and genuinely believes his family made their money through hard work and smart business decisions. Sweet man, terrible judge of character when it comes to his own blood. His family operates Chen Development Group, one of those construction companies that seems to win every major bid in the Phoenix metro area. They build shopping centers, office complexes, residential developments. On paper, they're pillars of the community. Robert Chen, my father-in-law, sits on the board of 3 charities and gets his picture taken with politicians at fundraising dinners. Patricia, my mother-in-law, hosts garden parties for the wives of other prominent businessmen and talks about giving back to the community. What David doesn't know, what none of their social circle knows, is that I'm not actually a court clerk. I mean, technically I do work at the courthouse, but not in the way they think. See, when I introduced myself as Rachel Martinez, who works at the federal courthouse, they assumed I was some low-level administrator filing papers and answering phones. I never corrected them. Why would I? It was fascinating to watch how they treated someone they perceived as beneath them. The truth is, I'm Judge Rachel Martinez of the United States District Court for the District of Arizona. I've been on the federal bench for 6 years, appointed when I was 34 after a distinguished career as a federal prosecutor. My specialty was white-collar crime, corporate fraud, environmental violations. The kind of cases that require patience, attention to detail, and an understanding of how wealthy people hide money and cover their tracks. For the past 18 months, I've been overseeing one of the most comprehensive federal investigations into construction fraud that Arizona has seen in decades. Multiple agencies involved: FBI Financial Crimes Unit, EPA violations, IRS Criminal Division, the works. The target, Chen Development Group and their network of shell companies, bribed inspectors, falsified environmental reports, and tax evasion schemes that would make a mobster blush. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every Sunday dinner where Patricia made comments about my little government job and how I should be grateful David was willing to marry down, I was reviewing evidence that would eventually destroy everything they'd built. Every time Robert lectured me about how real success comes from taking risks and building something meaningful, I was signing warrants for financial records that showed exactly what kind of risks he'd been taking with other people's money. But today was different. Today was Amanda's baby shower, and Patricia had outdone herself in terms of treating me like hired help. Amanda is David's younger sister, the golden child, married to Michael Thompson, who works for some hedge fund in Scottsdale. They live in a house that costs more than most people make in a lifetime, drive cars that cost more than my annual salary, and generally act like they've solved the secret to human existence through strategic consumption. The baby shower was being held at Desert Ridge Golf and Country Club, one of those places where the membership fee costs more than a decent car, and they remember your drink preferences from visits 6 months apart. I'd been to exactly 3 events there in the past 3 years, always as David's +1, never quite fitting into the world of women who spent their mornings at Pilates and their afternoons discussing which private schools their toddlers should attend. David and I arrived 20 minutes early because Patricia had specifically requested that I help with the setup. Not asked, requested. like I was part of the catering staff. David kissed me goodbye in the parking lot, heading off to play golf with Robert and Michael while the women handled the baby celebration. He had no idea what he was walking into, and honestly, neither did I. Not completely. The country club's private event room overlooked the 18th green, floor-to-ceiling windows, letting in that harsh Arizona sunlight that makes everything look washed out by noon. Patricia had gone all out with the decorations, pink and gold everything, because Amanda was having a girl. 3-tiered cake, champagne fountain, floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Professional photographer, catered lunch, gift table that looked like a small department store had exploded. I walked in wearing a simple navy dress that I'd bought at Nordstrom, something appropriate but not flashy. I'd learned early in my marriage that showing up looking too polished or expensive made Patricia uncomfortable, like I was trying to compete with her or Amanda. Better to blend in, stay neutral, avoid giving her ammunition for her passive-aggressive comments about people who try too hard. Patricia spotted me immediately, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound welcoming but wasn't. "Oh good, Rachel's here, perfect timing." She was wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, her jewelry catching the light every time she moved her hands. "I was just telling the caterers where to set up the gift station. You can help them organize everything alphabetically. You're so good with that sort of detailed work." There it was, the subtle dig disguised as a compliment. Rachel's good with the tedious, thankless tasks that require no creativity or social skills. Rachel can handle the boring organizational work while the real guests enjoy themselves. I smiled and nodded, watching as she turned back to greet Patricia Morrison, the wife of some city council member, like I'd already disappeared. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in social hierarchy. I arranged gifts, refilled champagne glasses, took coats, directed guests to the restroom, and generally functioned as unpaid event staff while Patricia and Amanda held court at the center of the room. The conversation flowed around me like I was furniture, these women discussing their latest shopping trips, upcoming vacations to Europe, their children's private school drama, the challenges of finding good domestic.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Help. Amanda, glowing in her designer maternity dress, kept one hand on her belly while gesturing dramatically about nursery themes and baby names. She'd inherited her mother's talent for making everything about herself while appearing generous and inclusive. Every gift she opened was met with theatrical gasps and comments about how perfect and thoughtful everything was, but I noticed she never made eye contact with me, even when I was standing 3 feet away refilling her water glass. The photographer, a thin woman with an expensive camera and the kind of aggressive energy that comes from dealing with demanding clients, moved through the room, capturing candid moments and posed shots. She photographed Amanda opening gifts, Patricia giving a toast, groups of women laughing around the champagne fountain. When she pointed the camera in my direction, Patricia smoothly stepped into the frame, positioning herself between me and the lens. "We want to focus on the guest of honor today," she said with that practiced smile. I was arranging the open gifts on a display table when I heard Patricia talking to Margaret Chen, Robert's sister who'd flown in from San Diego. Her voice was just loud enough to carry, just casual enough to sound like innocent conversation rather than deliberate cruelty. "It's so sweet how David found someone who understands her place," Patricia was saying. "Not everyone could handle being married into a family like ours. It takes a certain kind of person to appreciate what they're gaining instead of focusing on what they might think they deserve." Margaret made some non-committal sound, but Patricia continued. "Rachel works at the courthouse, you know, just filing paperwork and that sort of thing. Very steady work, very reliable. Perfect for someone who prefers structure over ambition." I kept arranging ribbons and tissue paper, my hands steady, my expression neutral. 3 tables away, Amanda was opening a gift from her college roommate, squealing about tiny designer clothes that cost more per piece than most adults spend on an entire outfit. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Amanda's worth was measured in dollars spent on her, mine was measured in how little trouble I caused. But what Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the paperwork I filed included federal indictments. The structure I preferred was the United States legal system. And the reliability she was describing included 18 months of building an airtight case against her husband's company that would result in criminal charges, asset forfeiture, and very likely prison time. The gift opening ceremony reached its peak when Amanda unwrapped the final present, a custom-designed baby mobile that played classical music and projected stars onto the ceiling. Patricia clasped her hands together and announced that it was time for the toast, calling everyone to gather around with their champagne glasses. I was in the back corner near the gift table, holding a glass of sparkling water because I'd learned that drinking alcohol at these events gave Patricia more ammunition for her comments about people who need liquid courage to handle social situations. Amanda stood at the center of the room, one hand on her belly, surrounded by women who worked very hard to project success and happiness through expensive clothes and practiced smiles. Patricia raised her glass and launched into a speech about family, tradition, and the importance of building something lasting for future generations. She talked about the Chen family legacy, about teaching children the value of hard work and integrity, about surrounding yourself with people who understand what really matters in life. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. To Amanda, Patricia concluded, who has always known her worth and never settled for less than she deserved. And to all of us who understand that family means lifting each other up and creating a life of meaning and purpose, everyone applauded. Amanda wiped away a tear and hugged her mother. The photographer captured the moment from multiple angles. I smiled and clapped along, watching this performance of family values from people who built their wealth on fraud, environmental violations, and systematic tax evasion. That's when my phone buzzed. A text message that only I could see, from Agent Sarah Kim of the FBI's Phoenix field office. 3 words, "We're moving tomorrow." I looked at the phone screen, then at the room full of people celebrating Amanda's pregnancy with money that legally belonged to the federal government. In less than 24 hours, teams of federal agents would be executing search warrants at Chen Development Group, their accountant's office, their personal residence, and 6 other locations across Arizona and Nevada. Bank accounts would be frozen. Assets would be seized. A criminal enterprise disguised as a family business would come to an end. But first, I had to get through the rest of this baby shower. Patricia was calling for group photos, organizing people around Amanda like she was directing a movie scene. "Rachel, would you mind cleaning up the gift table while we take some pictures? We want to get some shots without all the clutter in the background." Of course, the person who wasn't worth including in the photos could handle the cleanup. I nodded and started gathering torn wrapping paper and empty boxes while the photographer arranged the real guests in flattering poses. Patricia made sure Amanda was positioned in the center, her belly prominently displayed, surrounded by women who represented success, family, and social status. I worked quietly in the background, invisible except when they needed something. Plates cleared, glasses refilled, chairs rearranged. The perfect servant, grateful for the opportunity to be useful. What they saw was David's humble wife, the court clerk who married above her station and knew better than to draw attention to herself. What I was actually doing was observing, listening, cataloging every detail about their lifestyle, their attitudes, their casual dismissal of legal and ethical boundaries, every comment about money, success, and what they deserved, every assumption about people they considered beneath them. Because tomorrow, when the FBI showed up with warrants and handcuffs, they'd discover that the quiet woman they'd been ordering around for 3 years wasn't just some low-level government employee. She was the federal judge who'd been overseeing their investigation from day one. The same hands they'd watched, arrange their gifts and clean their dishes were the hands that had signed every warrant, approved every wiretap, and authorized every financial seizure that would bring down their criminal empire. The baby shower wrapped up around 4 in the afternoon. Amanda made a show of hugging everyone goodbye, thanking them for their generosity and love. Patricia coordinated the loading of gifts into cars, making sure everything was properly organized and accounted for. The photographer promised to have edited photos ready within a week. I was loading boxes into Amanda's Range Rover when Patricia appeared beside me, her voice dropping to that confidential tone she used when she wanted to deliver particularly pointed advice. "You know, Rachel, I've been thinking about your future. David's going to want to start a family soon, and it might be time to consider whether your little job is really worth the stress. A man like David needs a wife who can focus on what's important, not someone who's always worried about deadlines and office politics." I closed the car's trunk and turned to face her. "My work is important to me, Patricia. I find it fulfilling." She smiled that practiced smile, the one that was supposed to soften the blow of whatever cutting remark was coming next. "Oh, I'm sure it feels that way now. But once you have children, you'll understand what real fulfillment looks like. Being there for your family, creating a beautiful home, supporting your husband's career. That's where a woman finds her true purpose." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her wisdom. "You're probably right. I should think about what legacy I want to leave." "Exactly," Patricia said, patting my arm like she was proud of me for finally understanding. "Family legacy is everything. Building something that lasts, something your children can be proud of." In 18 hours, her definition of family legacy was going to change dramatically. But I just smiled and thanked her for the advice, watching as she walked back toward the country club in her designer heels, confident that she'd successfully put me in my place once again. David found me in the parking lot 20 minutes later, sunburned and relaxed from his golf game. He kissed my cheek and asked how the baby shower went, and I told him it was lovely. Amanda had been glowing, Patricia had outdone herself with the arrangements, everyone had been very generous with gifts. All true, from a certain perspective. We drove home to our modest townhouse in Tempe, David chatting about his golf game and his plans for the upcoming work week. He had no idea that by this time tomorrow, his sister would be calling him in tears, his parents would be meeting with criminal defense attorneys, and his wife would be holding a press conference about the largest white-collar crime prosecution in Arizona's recent history. I made dinner while David showered, something simple from ingredients we already had in the house. As I chopped vegetables and stirred sauce, I thought about the 18 months of investigation that had led to this moment. The financial records that showed millions of dollars in fraudulent billing. The environmental reports that had been falsified to hide contamination at construction sites. The network of bribes and kickbacks that allowed Chen Development Group to win contracts they had no business getting. Tomorrow, the careful methodical work of federal law enforcement would intersect with the Chen family's world of charity galas and country club memberships. The quiet court clerk they'd been patronizing for 3 years would step into her actual role as a federal judge, and they'd discover that the justice system they thought they were above had been watching them all along. But tonight, I was just Rachel, David's wife, cleaning up after dinner, and getting ready for what would either be the most satisfying or most complicated day of my career. Because tomorrow, justice wasn't just coming for the Chen family's construction empire, it was coming from someone they'd treated like hired help, delivered by hands they'd watched scrub their dishes and arrange their gifts. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one where people don't think you have any power at all. The drive home from the country club gave me time to process what had just happened, though honestly, I'd experienced worse treatment from the Chen family. What struck me wasn't the casual cruelty or the systematic exclusion. I'd grown accustomed to being treated like household staff whenever we gathered for their celebrations. What struck me was how comfortable they'd become with it, how natural it felt for them to order me around in front of their friends. Patricia had actually introduced me to 3 different women as David's wife, who helps us out with family events. Not as her daughter-in-law, not as a professional with my own career, but as someone whose primary value lay in her willingness to perform unpaid labor for their social gatherings. Margaret Chen had looked me up and down when we were introduced, taking in my simple navy dress and modest jewelry, and asked what kind of work I did at the courthouse. "Oh, just administrative things," I'd replied, watching her expression shift from polite interest to dismissive understanding. Administrative work was code for replaceable, unimportant, the kind of job that required showing up on time and following instructions rather than any particular intelligence or ambition. Margaret had nodded and immediately turned her attention back to Patricia, launching into a conversation about Amanda's nursery designer that excluded me as effectively as if I'd simply vanished. The thing is, I hadn't started out being quite so deliberately vague about my work. In the early days of my relationship with David, I'd been more forthcoming about my background as a federal prosecutor, my appointment to the bench, the types of cases I handled. But I quickly learned that this information made the Chen family uncomfortable in ways that were hard to define but impossible to ignore. Robert would get this look on his face whenever legal topics came up in conversation, like he was trying to solve a math problem in his head. Patricia would change the subject with the aggressive brightness of someone who'd stepped on a landmine and was trying to pretend it hadn't happened. Amanda would make comments about how intense it must be to work in such a serious environment, as if prosecuting financial crimes was somehow unseemly or inappropriate for a woman in her social circle. So I'd learned to downplay it. When they asked about work, I mentioned the courthouse, but not my role in it. When they made assumptions about my position and salary, I didn't correct them. When Patricia talked about David supporting me financially, I let her believe that my government salary was so minimal as to be essentially decorative. This strategy had two major benefits. First, it made family gatherings significantly more pleasant. The Chen family was much more comfortable with a daughter-in-law who posed no threat to their social hierarchy, who required their guidance and approval, who could be counted on to handle the tedious logistics of their events without expecting recognition or gratitude. Second, and more importantly for my current situation, it gave me an incredible vantage point for observing how wealthy people talked about money and business when they thought no one important was listening. For 18 months, I'd been attending dinners and parties where Robert and his business associates discussed strategies that ranged from ethically questionable to outright criminal, secure in the knowledge that David's little court clerk wife wasn't sophisticated enough to understand the implications of what she was hearing. I'd heard conversations about inspector payoffs disguised as consulting fees. I'd listened to detailed discussions about environmental report modifications that would allow construction on contaminated land. I'd watched Robert explain to other developers how creative accounting could turn taxable income into untraceable offshore investments. All of this while I served drinks, cleared plates, and maintained the expression of polite disinterest that wealthy people expect from their domestic help. The federal investigation into Chen Development Group had actually started before I married into the family. The FBI had been tracking unusual patterns in city contract awards, following money trails that suggested systematic corruption in the Phoenix construction industry. When my name came up as David Chen's wife, during routine background checks, Agent Kim had initially been concerned about potential conflicts of interest. That concern disappeared when we realized what an unprecedented opportunity this represented. A federal judge with direct access to the inner workings of a criminal organization, family dinners where the perpetrators discussed their crimes openly, social events where evidence was essentially being handed over on silver platters. Of course, I had to recuse myself from any direct involvement in prosecutorial decisions. The actual indictments would be handled by Judge Morrison in the Eastern District, with the case eventually transferred to my colleague Judge Stevens. But there's nothing in federal law that prevents a judge from observing criminal behavior and reporting it to appropriate authorities, especially when that criminal behavior is being discussed openly in the judge's presence. The ethical considerations had been complex, and I'd spent considerable time consulting with colleagues and ethics experts to ensure that every aspect of the investigation remained above board. But ultimately, the law was clear. When civilians witness criminal activity, they have not just the right, but the obligation to report it. The fact that I happened to be a federal judge didn't change that fundamental responsibility. What it did change was the quality and detail of the intelligence we were able to gather. Financial crimes cases typically require months or years of painstaking document analysis, following paper trails through multiple jurisdictions and corporate entities. But when you have access to the people planning the crimes, when they're explaining their methods and motivations over Sunday dinner, the investigation process becomes exponentially more efficient. Robert Chen was particularly fond of lecturing people about business strategy. He had opinions about everything from municipal bidding processes to environmental regulations, and he wasn't shy about sharing detailed explanations of how successful developers navigated these challenges. What he thought he was doing was impressing his family and friends with his expertise. What he was actually doing was providing a federal judge with comprehensive admissions of criminal activity. The first major breakthrough had come during Amanda's engagement party 2 years ago. I'd been organizing gift bags in the kitchen while Robert held court in the living room, explaining to Michael's father how Chen Development Group had managed to secure the contract for a major shopping center, despite being underbid by 2 competitors. The trick, Robert had said, his voice carrying easily through the open floor plan, is understanding that the lowest bid doesn't always win. Inspectors have a lot of discretion in their reports, and discretion can be influenced by the right kind of consulting relationships. Michael's father had asked what kind of consulting relationships he meant, and Robert had launched into a detailed explanation of how monthly retainer payments to former city employees could ensure favorable inspection results. He'd named specific inspectors, mentioned dollar amounts, even explained how these payments were structured to avoid triggering IRS reporting requirements. I'd stood in that kitchen, calmly folding tissue paper around champagne glasses, while a man describing a textbook corruption scheme to a room full of people who thought it was brilliant business strategy. The next morning, I'd called Agent Kim with enough specific information to launch a full financial investigation. That conversation had been recorded, of course, not by me. I want to be clear about that. But Michael's father, unbeknownst to everyone in the room, had been wearing a wire. He'd been cooperating with federal investigators for 8 months at that point, part of a separate investigation into hedge fund manipulation that had eventually intersected with the Chen development case. The recording of Robert Chen explaining his bribery system had been the foundation for every warrant request, every financial seizure order, and every criminal charge that was about to be filed. But it wasn't the only evidence we'd gathered through my access to the family. There had been the Christmas dinner, where Patricia had complained about the ridiculous environmental restrictions on their latest project, leading to Robert's detailed explanation of how they'd falsified soil contamination reports to avoid costly remediation. There had been the birthday party where Amanda had mentioned that her father was teaching Michael about creative tax strategies, prompting Robert to describe offshore shell companies with the enthusiasm of someone explaining his favorite hobby. Most recently, there had been last month's anniversary celebration, where Robert had proudly announced that Chen Development Group was about to close their largest deal ever, a mixed-use development worth over $200 million. He'd explained how they'd structured the financing to minimize tax liability, how they'd negotiated favorable environmental assessments, and how they'd secured city approval through what he called relationship building with municipal officials. Every detail he'd shared had been passed along to federal investigators. Every name he'd mentioned had been added to the list of potential co-conspirators. Every dollar amount had been cross-referenced against tax filings and bank records that inevitably showed discrepancies large enough to support criminal charges. The irony was profound. The Chen family had spent 3 years treating me like hired help, someone too insignificant to worry about, too unintelligent to understand the implications of what she was hearing. They'd ordered me around, excluded me from conversations they considered important, and generally behaved as if I existed only to make their lives more convenient. What they'd actually done was provide a federal judge with front-row seats to one of the most comprehensive criminal enterprises in Arizona's history. Every dismissive comment about my little government job had made me more invisible and therefore more capable of observing their criminal activity. Every time they'd relegated me to kitchen duty or gift organization, they'd created opportunities for me to overhear conversations that would eventually send them to prison. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the entire situation was how completely they'd misunderstood the nature of power and status. The Chen family measured worth in terms of money, property, and social connections. They assumed that someone with a modest salary and simple lifestyle must be less intelligent, less ambitious, and less capable than they were. What they'd failed to consider was that federal judges are appointed for life precisely because they don't need to worry about money or social status. We're insulated from financial pressure and social manipulation because our power comes from the Constitution, not from quarterly earnings or country club memberships. We can afford to drive modest cars and live in ordinary houses because our authority doesn't depend on impressing anyone. The Chen family had spent 3 years trying to make me feel inferior because I didn't live their lifestyle or share their values. What they hadn't realized was that I didn't want their lifestyle, I didn't need their approval, and I certainly didn't envy their money, especially since I knew exactly how they'd obtained it and how little time they had left to enjoy it. Tomorrow morning would bring the end of their criminal enterprise and the beginning of a very different kind of family dynamic. Robert and Patricia would discover that the daughter-in-law they'd been patronizing for 3 years had been instrumental in documenting their crimes. Amanda would learn that her comfortable lifestyle had been built on fraud and corruption. David would have to reconcile his image of his family with the reality of what they'd actually been doing for the past decade. But tonight, they were all sleeping soundly in their expensive beds, confident that their money and connections would continue to protect them from consequences. Tonight, they still believed that people like me existed to serve people like them, that class and status were permanent features of the social order, that wealth was its own form of immunity from justice. Tomorrow would be educational for everyone involved. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30, which is earlier than usual, but not dramatically so. David was still sleeping, and I made coffee quietly in our small kitchen, watching the sunrise through windows that needed cleaning. Our townhouse is comfortable but unremarkable, the kind of place where middle-class professionals live when they're focused on careers rather than lifestyle display. I'd chosen this neighborhood specifically because it was nothing like Paradise Valley, where the Chen family lived. Tempe is diverse, unpretentious, full of professors and engineers and small business owners who care more about substance than surface. Our neighbors include a retired teacher, a social worker, a couple who run a small restaurant downtown, people who work hard, pay their taxes, and contribute to their communities without expecting special recognition for it. David had never complained about our modest lifestyle, but I knew he sometimes felt defensive about it when we visited his family. His childhood home is a mansion by any reasonable standard, 5 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms on 2 acres of manicured desert landscape. His parents drive cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries and vacation in places that require private jets to reach conveniently. When we first got married, Patricia had made subtle suggestions about David's career trajectory, wondering aloud whether he might be more fulfilled in private sector consulting rather than corporate cybersecurity. She'd mentioned opportunities at firms where Robert had connections, positions that would come with significant salary increases, and the kind of lifestyle flexibility that would allow for proper family vacations and social obligations. David had politely deflected these suggestions, explaining that he enjoyed his work and valued the security that came with corporate employment. What he hadn't said, but what I understood, was that he had no interest in the kind of business relationships that his father cultivated. David was fundamentally honest, uncomfortable with the gray areas that his family navigated so easily. This moral clarity was one of the things I'd fallen in love with, but it also meant that David had spent most of his adult life willfully blind to the reality of how his family made their money. He knew that Chen Development Group was successful, but he'd never asked probing questions about their methods or examined their financial practices too closely. In some ways, this had made the investigation easier. David's genuine ignorance of his family's criminal activity meant that I didn't have to worry about compromising him or putting him in an impossible position. He wasn't a co-conspirator or even a knowing beneficiary of their crimes. He was just a son who loved his family and assumed their success was legitimate, but it also meant that today would be devastating for him. David would learn that his father was a criminal, his mother was complicit in fraud, and his sister had been living off money stolen from taxpayers and legitimate businesses. The family he'd grown up respecting would be revealed as a criminal organization, and the lifestyle he'd been raised in would be exposed as built on lies. I finished my coffee and checked my phone. Agent Kim had sent a message at midnight confirming that all teams were in position and warrants would be executed at 8 a.m. sharp. Chen Development Group's offices, Robert and Patricia's home, Amanda and Michael's house, their accountant's office, and 6 other locations would be searched simultaneously. Bank accounts would be frozen, assets would be seized, and criminal charges would be filed before the end of the day. The timing was crucial. White-collar criminals are sophisticated about moving money and destroying evidence when they suspect investigation. The only way to prevent them from protecting their assets is to move quickly and comprehensively, hitting every aspect of their operation before they have time to react. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing a conservative suit appropriate for federal court. Today would require multiple appearances, including a press conference about the charges and a hearing to address asset forfeiture motions. I needed to look like what I was, a federal judge overseeing one of the largest white-collar prosecutions in Arizona's recent history. David woke up while I was getting ready, stretching and yawning, and asking if I wanted to grab breakfast before work. He had no idea that in 3 hours, his phone would start ringing with calls from family members who'd been arrested on federal charges. He was thinking about his Monday morning meetings and wondering whether we needed to pick up groceries on the way home. I kissed him goodbye and told him I loved him, which was true but felt complicated given what was about to happen. David would eventually understand why I'd kept my role in the investigation secret, but the initial shock would be difficult for both of us. Our marriage would survive this, but it would require honest conversations about family loyalty, moral responsibility, and the difference between love and complicity. The drive to the federal courthouse took 20 minutes, giving me time to mentally prepare for what would be an unprecedented day in my judicial career. I'd handled complex white-collar cases before, but never one where I had personal relationships with the defendants. Never one where I'd spent years gathering evidence at family dinners. Never one where the revelation of criminal activity would destroy not just business relationships, but family bonds. Agent Kim was waiting in my chambers when I arrived, along with Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who would be handling the prosecution. The 3 of us had worked together on dozens of cases over the years, but this one was different in ways that went beyond the personal connections. "Everything's ready," Agent Kim said, handing me a folder containing final warrant applications and asset seizure orders. "Teams are positioned at all locations. We should have everyone in custody by 10 a.m. I reviewed the documents quickly, checking dates and legal citations out of habit rather than necessity. These warrants represented 18 months of meticulous investigation, thousands of hours of surveillance and financial analysis, and some of the most comprehensive evidence of organized corruption that federal prosecutors in Arizona had ever assembled. "What about David?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He's clean," Agent Walsh confirmed. "We've found no evidence that he was aware of his family's activities or that he benefited from them beyond normal family gifts and occasions. He's not being charged with anything." This was a relief, though not a surprise. David worked in legitimate cybersecurity, filed honest tax returns, and maintained financial accounts that showed no suspicious activity. His only crime had been loving his family and assuming their success was earned honestly. "He's going to need counseling," I said. "This will be traumatic for him." Agent Kim nodded. "We've arranged for victim services to reach out. Spouses of white-collar defendants often need support processing the reality of what their partners were doing. But David wasn't the spouse of a defendant. I was, and that made this situation more complicated than anything victim services had probably encountered before. At exactly 8 a.m., my phone started buzzing with text messages from numbers I didn't recognize, then calls, then more calls. By 8:15, my assistant was fielding media inquiries about the Chen Development Group arrests. By 8:30, the courthouse security team was dealing with reporters who wanted statements about the federal judge whose in-laws had just been charged with multiple felonies. I turned off my phone and focused on the legal paperwork that would formalize the end of the Chen family's criminal enterprise. Asset seizure orders, bank account freezes, property confiscations, and criminal charges that would result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, the Chen family had treated me like their personal servant, someone who existed to make their lives easier and their social events more convenient. They'd ordered me around, excluded me from important conversations, and generally behaved as if I was too insignificant to matter. What they'd actually done was provide a federal judge with comprehensive access to their criminal organization. Every dismissive comment had made me more invisible and therefore more effective at gathering evidence. Every time they'd sent me to the kitchen or assigned me organizational tasks, they'd created opportunities for me to observe criminal activity that would eventually destroy their empire. But the most satisfying aspect of the situation wasn't professional, it was personal. For 3 years, I'd watched the Chen family treat service workers, administrative staff, and anyone they perceived as beneath their social status with casual contempt. They'd assumed that people who worked for the government were less intelligent and less capable than people who worked in private business. Today, they'd learned that government service sometimes means wielding the full power of the federal justice system. They'd discover that the quiet woman they'd been ordering around for 3 years had been documenting their crimes and building the case that would end their freedom. The woman they'd treated like hired help was about to send them to federal prison. And unlike their money, their connections, and their social status, that kind of power doesn't disappear when bank accounts get frozen and assets get seized. Justice, as it turns out, is the one thing that money can't buy and social connections can't influence. And sometimes it comes from the person you least expect, delivered by hands you watched fold napkins and arrange party favors. At 9 a.m., my assistant knocked on my chamber's door and announced that David was on the phone. His voice was shaking when I answered. "Rachel," he said, "something's happening with my family. The FBI is at their house, they're saying something about arrests and federal charges. I don't understand what's going on." I took a deep breath and looked out the window of my chambers, where reporters were gathering on the courthouse steps, preparing for the press conference that would explain exactly what had been going on. "I know," I said quietly. "We need to talk." The conversation with David was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to navigate as both a wife and a federal judge. His voice carried a confusion that went deeper than surprise, the kind of disorientation that comes when your fundamental understanding of reality suddenly shifts. He kept asking questions I couldn't answer over the phone, kept trying to make sense of a situation that defied everything he thought he knew about his family. "They're saying Dad took bribes," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "They're talking about tax evasion and environmental violations and something about offshore accounts. Rachel, this has to be a mistake. Dad's always been so careful about following regulations, always talking about doing business the right way." I listened to him struggle with concepts that I'd been living with for 18 months. The cognitive dissonance of learning that people you love and respect have been living double lives, that the moral framework you thought you shared was actually one-sided. David was experiencing in real time what I'd been processing gradually through evidence files and recorded conversations. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "I'm driving to their house," Mom called crying, said they wouldn't let her get dressed properly before they took Dad away. She said there were agents everywhere, going through their computers and files and bank statements. "Rachel, what if they arrest Mom too?" The answer to that question was sitting in a file folder on my desk. Patricia Chen would be arrested before noon, charged with conspiracy, money laundering, and filing false tax returns. Her tears and confusion this morning were genuine, but they didn't change the fact that she'd participated in criminal activity for over a decade. "David, I need you to come to the courthouse instead of going to your parents' house. There are things we need to discuss, and it needs to be in person. I can't just abandon my family right now, they need me. Whatever's happening, whatever confusion there's been, they're going to need legal help and emotional support." This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. David's loyalty to his family was admirable in normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. His instinct to rush to their aid could complicate the federal investigation and potentially put him in legal jeopardy if he inadvertently interfered with evidence collection or witness interviews. David, listen to me carefully. Do not go to any of the locations where arrests are being made. Do not try to contact family members who might be in custody. Do not discuss this situation with anyone except me until we've had a chance to talk. Can you promise me that? There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear him trying to process why his wife was giving him instructions that sounded suspiciously like legal advice from someone with detailed knowledge of federal investigation procedures. How do you know what I should and shouldn't do? He asked finally. Rachel, you're scaring me. You sound like you know more about this than you should. The moment I'd been dreading for 18 months had arrived. In about 30 minutes, I'd have to look at the man I loved and explain that I'd been keeping secrets that would fundamentally change our marriage. That the woman he thought he'd married, the quiet court clerk who helped his family with party planning, was actually the federal judge who'd been instrumental in building the case against his parents and sister. Just come to the courthouse, I said. We'll talk about everything when you get here. After I hung up, I sat in my chambers, trying to prepare for a conversation that had no precedent in my personal or professional experience. How do you tell someone that you've been investigating their family for crimes they didn't know were being committed? How do you explain that every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every casual gathering had been an evidence collection opportunity? Agent Kim knocked and entered without waiting for permission, which told me that media attention was escalating quickly. We need to talk about timing for the press conference, she said. The story's already breaking online. Local news has footage of the arrests, and they're speculating about connections between the Chen family and federal judicial personnel. This was inevitable, but still concerning. The intersection of my personal relationships with my professional responsibilities was going to generate intense scrutiny from legal ethics experts, media analysts, and probably congressional oversight committees. Every decision I'd made over the past 18 months would be examined and second-guessed by people who'd never faced similar ethical challenges. What's the legal community saying? I asked. Mixed reactions so far. Some people are questioning whether you should have recused yourself earlier. Others are saying you handled it appropriately by removing yourself from prosecutorial decisions while still fulfilling your obligation to report criminal activity. The ethical landscape was genuinely complex. Federal judges are required to recuse themselves from cases where they have personal relationships with parties, but they're also citizens with obligations to report crimes they witness. The question of how to balance these responsibilities when criminal activity occurs within your own family hadn't been extensively litigated. I'd consulted with ethics experts, reviewed case law, and followed every guideline I could find. But ultimately, I'd been navigating uncharted territory with stakes that extended far beyond my own career. Any word from the family? Agent Kim asked. David's on his way here. He doesn't know about my involvement yet. She winced sympathetically. Agent Kim had been married for 15 years and had children of her own. She understood the personal cost of the choices I'd made, even if she agreed with them professionally. The others are in custody except for Amanda. She's at her lawyer's office with Michael, probably getting advice about plea negotiations. Amanda's situation was particularly complicated because her involvement in the family business was more limited than Robert's or Patricia's. She'd benefited from criminal proceeds and had occasionally participated in money laundering schemes, but she wasn't a primary architect of the fraud. Prosecutors were likely to offer her a deal in exchange for cooperation, especially if she could provide testimony about her father's activities. Michael, Amanda's husband, was in an even more complex position. His hedge fund had invested client money in Chen Development Group projects without disclosing the family relationship, which violated securities regulations. But like David, he appeared to have been genuinely unaware of the criminal nature of the business he was investing in. What about the environmental violations? I asked. That's where we'll see the most serious charges. The contaminated site near Scottsdale has groundwater pollution that could affect thousands of people. EPA is treating it as an environmental crime with potential for significant prison time. This was the aspect of the case that made me angriest on a personal level. Financial fraud was serious, but environmental crime had victims who had no idea they'd been harmed. Families whose drinking water had been contaminated by chemicals that Robert Chen knew were present, but chose to hide. Children who might develop health problems years from now because of corners cut to increase profit margins. The Chen family had spent 3 years lecturing me about success and achievement, about the importance of building something meaningful for future generations. What they'd actually built was a toxic legacy that would require decades and millions of taxpayer dollars to clean up. At 10:30, my assistant called to say that David had arrived and was waiting in the conference room. I gathered the files I'd need to explain the situation and walked down the hallway, trying to prepare myself for the most difficult conversation of our marriage. David was standing at the window when I entered, looking out at the reporters gathering on the courthouse steps. He turned when he heard the door close, and I could see that the events of the morning had aged him. His face carried a strain I'd never seen before, the look of someone whose world had shifted in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. "Rachel, what's going on? I've been getting calls from reporters asking about my wife's involvement in my family's arrests. They seem to think you're more than just a court clerk." I sat down at the conference table and gestured for him to join me. This conversation would go better if we were both seated, if I could maintain eye contact and speak calmly, rather than having him pace around the room. "David, there are things about my work that I haven't been able to discuss with you, not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I was legally obligated to maintain confidentiality about an ongoing federal investigation." He sat down slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching dread. "What kind of investigation?" "For the past 18 months, I've been overseeing a federal case involving white-collar crimes in the Phoenix construction industry. The investigation has focused on bid rigging, environmental violations, tax evasion, and systematic corruption of municipal inspection processes." David was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that I could see dawning in his expression. "When you say overseeing, you mean as a judge?" "Yes, I'm United States District Judge Rachel Martinez. I was appointed to the federal bench 6 years ago, after working as a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes." The silence that followed was one of the longest of my life. David stared at me like he was seeing a stranger, trying to reconcile the woman he'd been married to for 3 years with the federal judge sitting across from him. "You're not a court clerk," he said finally. "No, I let your family believe that because correcting their assumptions would have compromised an active investigation, and because their comfort with dismissing me as unimportant gave me access to conversations and activities that became crucial evidence in the case." "The case against my family?" "Yes." David stood up and walked back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture I recognized from when he was working through complex technical problems. But this wasn't a cybersecurity challenge that could be solved with logic and systematic analysis. This was personal betrayal, layered on top of criminal revelation, layered on top of the collapse of everything he'd believed about the people he loved most. "How long have you known," he asked without turning around, "about the criminal activity?" "I started noticing concerning patterns within the first year of our marriage. The investigation began formally about 18 months ago, and you never thought to tell me that my family were criminals." This was the question I'd been dreading, because the honest answer would hurt him even more than the deception had. "David, you have to understand the ethical and legal constraints I was operating under. Federal investigations require absolute confidentiality. I couldn't discuss ongoing cases with anyone, including you, without compromising the integrity of the judicial process. But you could gather evidence at family dinners, you could smile and nod, while my father explained business strategies that you knew were illegal. You could help my mother plan parties funded by money you knew was stolen." The pain in his voice was devastating because he was right. I had done all of those things. I'd maintained relationships with people I knew were criminals, participated in social events I knew were funded by fraud, and acted loving and supportive toward a family I was simultaneously working to send to prison. "I did what federal law required me to do," I said quietly. "When civilians witness criminal activity, they're obligated to report it. When federal judges witness criminal activity, that obligation becomes even more serious. But I'm not just any civilian, I'm your husband. Doesn't that create some kind of different obligation?" This was the heart of the ethical dilemma I'd been wrestling with for 18 months. The competing loyalties between marriage and justice, between personal relationships and professional responsibility, between protecting the person I loved and protecting the broader community from criminal harm. If I had told you what I knew, what would you have done? I asked. David turned from the window to look at me directly. I would have confronted them. I would have demanded that they stop whatever illegal activities they were involved in. I would have tried to get them to cooperate with investigators and minimize the damage, and if they had refused, then I would have had to choose between my family and what was right. Exactly, and I couldn't put you in that position. I couldn't make you choose between protecting criminals and protecting your marriage, so I made the choice for both of us. The logic was sound, but I could see in David's expression that logical explanations weren't sufficient for emotional wounds. He felt betrayed, not just by his family's criminal activity, but by my decision to investigate them secretly. He felt manipulated by 18 months of carefully managed conversations and strategically withheld information. Were you gathering evidence on me too? He asked. No, you were never under suspicion. Your financial records are clean, your work history shows no connection to your family's business activities, and you've never participated in any of the conversations or meetings where criminal activity was discussed. But you were watching, you were evaluating everything I said and did to determine whether I was complicit. This was another painful truth. In the early stages of the investigation, before we understood the scope of David's ignorance about his family's activities, he had been subject to background checks and financial scrutiny. We'd monitored his communications and analyzed his behavior for signs of criminal knowledge or participation. Initially, yes, but it became clear very quickly that
You had no knowledge of or involvement in your family's criminal activities. You've been treated as a witness, not as a suspect. David sat back down, but this time he chose a chair across the room rather than next to me at the conference table. The physical distance felt symbolic of the emotional gap that had opened between us during this conversation. So what happens now? He asked. Your parents will be arraigned this afternoon on federal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, tax evasion, and environmental crimes. They'll likely be released on bail with conditions that include asset freezes and travel restrictions. Amanda will probably be offered a plea agreement in exchange for cooperation. Michael may face securities violations related to his investment activities. And us? This was the question that would determine whether our marriage survived the revelation of the past 18 months. Whether David could forgive me for the secrecy, whether I could help him process the collapse of his family, whether we could rebuild trust after such a fundamental deception. That depends on whether you can understand why I made the choices I made, and whether you can accept that sometimes doing the right thing requires hurting people you care about. David was quiet for several minutes, looking out the window at the reporters who were documenting the end of his family's criminal enterprise and the beginning of his personal reckoning with their true nature. I need time, he said finally. I need to process all of this. The arrests, the charges, your role in the investigation, what this means for our marriage. I can't make any decisions right now about anything. This was reasonable and probably healthy, though it left me in an emotionally precarious position. I'd spent 18 months carrying the burden of knowledge about David's family while maintaining the facade of normal relationships. Now he knew the truth, but I didn't know whether our marriage would survive the revelation. Take all the time you need, I said, but David, I want you to know that everything I felt for you and your family was real. The love, the care, the genuine affection, that was never fake. What was complicated was how to balance those feelings with my professional obligations and moral responsibilities. He nodded without looking at me. I know you think you did the right thing. I just don't know yet whether I can live with the way you did it. After David left, I returned to my chambers to prepare for the press conference that would make my role in the investigation public. The questions would be intense and the scrutiny would be unprecedented, but at least I wouldn't have to maintain the pretense of being someone I wasn't. For 3 years I'd been David's quiet court clerk wife, helping his family with party planning and social events while they treated me like hired help. For 18 months, I'd been gathering evidence that would destroy their criminal enterprise while they lectured me about success and achievement. Now I could be what I'd always been. Judge Rachel Martinez of the United States District Court, someone whose authority came from the Constitution rather than from wealth or social connections. Someone whose power couldn't be dismissed or diminished by people who assumed that government workers were inferior to private business owners. The Chen family had spent 3 years underestimating me because they measured worth in terms of money and status. They'd failed to understand that federal judges wield a different kind of power, one that doesn't depend on quarterly earnings or social approval. Today they would learn that the woman they'd treated as their servant had been holding the full authority of the federal justice system all along. And unlike their assets, their connections, and their social status, that kind of power doesn't disappear when bank accounts get frozen and criminal charges get filed. The irony was profound, but it wasn't satisfying. Justice had been served, but at the cost of a marriage that might not survive the revelation of how it had been accomplished. The Chen family would face the consequences of their criminal activity, but David would also face the consequences of choices I'd made without his knowledge or consent. Sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrifices that extend beyond the people who deserve punishment. Sometimes justice comes with a personal cost that makes victory feel hollow even when it's absolutely necessary. But as I prepared to face the media and explain my role in bringing down one of Arizona's largest criminal organizations, I reminded myself why this case had mattered enough to risk everything. Environmental contamination that would affect thousands of families. Tax fraud that stole resources from schools and infrastructure. Corruption that undermined the integrity of municipal government. The Chen family had built their wealth by externalizing the costs of their crimes onto innocent people. They'd poisoned groundwater, evaded taxes, and bribed officials while living in luxury and lecturing others about success and achievement. If the price of stopping them was my marriage and my anonymity, it was still the right choice. Some things matter more than personal happiness or family loyalty. Some responsibilities are bigger than individual relationships. Justice doesn't care about your feelings or your family connections. It doesn't make exceptions for people you love or crimes that seem victimless. And sometimes it requires federal judges to send their in-laws to prison regardless of the personal cost. The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By 3 o'clock, the world would know that federal judge Rachel Martinez had spent 3 years infiltrating a criminal organization disguised as a family, gathering evidence at dinner parties while the defendants treated her like domestic help. The woman they'd dismissed as a court clerk was about to explain how she'd documented their crimes and built the case that would send them to federal prison. The servant they'd ordered around was about to demonstrate exactly what kind of power she'd been wielding all along. And David, somewhere across the city, was trying to understand how the quiet wife he'd thought he knew had turned out to be someone capable of systematically destroying his family while maintaining the appearance of love and loyalty. The complexity of that revelation would take much longer than a press conference to resolve. The press conference was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 6 years on the federal bench. Usually, judicial press conferences involve dry legal explanations about sentencing guidelines or procedural changes. This was different. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, photographers, and television cameras, all focused on a story that combined federal crime prosecution with family betrayal in ways that made for irresistible media coverage. I stood behind the podium wearing my most conservative suit, flanked by Agent Kim and U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, facing questions that probed not just the legal aspects of the case but the ethical implications of my personal involvement. The first reporter asked the question I'd been expecting: whether it was appropriate for a federal judge to investigate her own family members. To be clear, I said, I did not investigate my family members. When I became aware of criminal activity through my presence at family gatherings, I reported that information to appropriate federal authorities, as any citizen is obligated to do. I then recused myself from all prosecutorial decisions and judicial proceedings related to the case. The follow-up question came immediately. But Judge Martinez, didn't your access to private family conversations give federal investigators an unfair advantage? This was the crux of the ethical debate that would probably follow me for the rest of my career. The intersection of personal relationships and professional obligations, the question of where family loyalty should end and civic responsibility should begin. Federal law enforcement operates within strict guidelines about evidence collection and constitutional protections, I replied. All evidence gathered in this case was obtained through legal means, including lawful surveillance, properly executed warrants, and information voluntarily provided by witnesses. The fact that some witnesses had personal relationships with the subjects of investigation doesn't invalidate the evidence or the legal process. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they didn't address the deeper moral complexity of what I'd done. Legal and ethical aren't always the same thing. Constitutional and compassionate don't always align. I'd followed every rule and guideline I could find, but I'd still spent 3 years maintaining intimate relationships with people I was helping to prosecute. The questions continued for 45 minutes, covering everything from the environmental impact of Chen Development Group's violations to the broader implications for judicial ethics. I answered each one carefully, professionally, trying to balance transparency with the ongoing legal proceedings that would determine the ultimate consequences for Robert, Patricia, and Amanda. When it was over, I walked back into the federal courthouse feeling exposed in ways that had nothing to do with media attention. For 3 years, I'd been able to compartmentalize my professional obligations and personal relationships. The press conference had forced me to defend those choices publicly, to articulate the reasoning behind decisions that had felt necessary in private but sounded calculated and cold when explained to strangers. Agent Kim caught up with me in the elevator. "That went well," she said. "You handled the ethics questions professionally." But I wasn't feeling professional. I was feeling like someone who just publicly justified destroying her husband's family, regardless of how legally sound those justifications were. "Any word from David?" I asked. "He's been calling his parents' attorney, trying to understand the charges and the evidence. He hasn't tried to contact any of the defendants directly, which shows good judgment." This was something, at least. David was smart enough to avoid actions that could complicate the federal case or put himself in legal jeopardy, but it also meant he was processing the collapse of his family's world without the support of his wife, because I was the person responsible for that collapse. The rest of the afternoon was consumed by legal paperwork and coordination with federal prosecutors who would be handling the actual trial proceedings. Asset forfeiture motions, bail hearings, plea negotiation protocols. The mechanical processes of federal justice that would transform the Chen family's criminal enterprise into court documents and prison sentences. Robert Chen was denied bail due to flight risk and the seriousness of the environmental charges. Patricia was released on $1 million bond with electronic monitoring and asset restrictions. Amanda was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation. Michael was negotiating a settlement with securities regulators that would end his career in finance but avoid criminal charges. By 6 o'clock, I was exhausted and emotionally drained. I drove home to our townhouse in Tempe, not knowing whether David would be there or whether he'd decided to stay somewhere else while he processed the revelations of the day. His car was in the driveway, which was encouraging, but I had no idea what kind of conversation was waiting for me inside. David was sitting at our kitchen table with legal documents spread in front of him, trying to understand the charges against his family. He looked up when I walked in, and his expression was unreadable. "I've been reading about conspiracy charges," he said. "Trying to understand how my parents could be facing 20 years in federal prison for what I thought was a successful construction business." I sat down across from him, careful not to disturb the papers he'd been reviewing. The evidence is comprehensive. Financial records, recorded conversations, testimony from co-conspirators. This isn't a case built on circumstantial evidence or prosecutorial speculation, including recorded conversations from family dinners. This was the question that struck at the heart of his anger and confusion. Not just that his family were criminals, but that his wife had been documenting their crimes while sitting at their dinner table. Some of the evidence came from social gatherings. Yes, but David, you have to understand that these weren't private conversations between family members. These were business discussions about criminal activity, often involving multiple people who weren't family members. But you were there as my wife, you were there because they trusted you, because they thought of you as family. He was right, and the weight of that betrayal was something I'd have to carry regardless of the legal justification for my actions. The Chen family had included me in their lives, had welcomed me into their home, had trusted me with access to their private conversations. I'd used that trust to gather evidence that would destroy them. If you'd known what they were doing, what would you have wanted me to do? I asked. David was quiet for a long time, looking at the legal documents that detailed his parents' systematic criminal activity over the past decade. I would have wanted you to tell me, he said finally. I would have wanted us to figure out together how to handle it. Maybe we could have convinced them to stop or to cooperate with investigators or to find some way to minimize the harm. And if they'd refused, if they'd continued committing crimes while you knew about it, then I would have had to choose between my family and what was right. But it would have been my choice to make. This was the fundamental disagreement between us, the ethical divide that might end our marriage. David believed that family loyalty should take precedence over abstract legal obligations. That personal relationships created moral duties that superseded civic responsibilities. I believed that some crimes were serious enough to justify betraying personal trust, that environmental contamination and systematic fraud created obligations that went beyond family dynamics. David, your parents poisoned groundwater that supplies drinking water to thousands of families. They evaded millions of dollars in taxes that fund schools and infrastructure. They bribed municipal officials and falsified safety inspections. These aren't victimless crimes or technical violations. I know, he said quietly. I'm not defending what they did. I'm questioning how you did what you did. The distinction was important, and it showed that David was processing the situation more thoughtfully than I'd initially realized. He wasn't denying his family's criminal activity or trying to minimize the seriousness of their actions. He was struggling with the methods I'd used to expose them, with the personal betrayal that had been necessary to achieve legal justice. Can you forgive me? I asked. I don't know yet. I understand why you felt like you had to do it. I even agree that stopping them was the right thing to do. But I don't know if I can live with someone who was capable of maintaining those kinds of secrets for so long. This was honest and painful, and probably the best answer I could hope for under the circumstances. David needed time to process not just his family's criminal activity but his wife's capacity for deception in service of what she believed was a greater good. We spent the evening in careful conversation, talking about practical matters like media attention and legal proceedings while avoiding the deeper questions about trust and loyalty that would determine our future. David was grieving the loss of the family he'd thought he had, and I was grieving the loss of the marriage I'd thought I could preserve. The next few days brought a parade of legal developments and media coverage that made normal life impossible. Robert Chen was indicted on 14 federal charges. Patricia pled guilty to conspiracy and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Amanda's plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. Michael's investment firm was dissolved and his assets were frozen pending restitution payments. The environmental cleanup at the contaminated construction site would cost an estimated $40 million and take years to complete. The tax fraud investigation had expanded to include other construction companies that had used similar schemes. The municipal corruption charges had implicated 3 city council members and 5 building inspectors. What had started as a family investigation had become a comprehensive examination of systematic corruption in Phoenix's construction industry. The Chen family's criminal enterprise had been the entry point for federal prosecutors. But they'd discovered a network of fraud and environmental crime that extended far beyond one family's business activities. Media attention was intense and mostly focused on the unusual aspects of my personal involvement in the case. Legal ethics experts were divided about whether I'd handled the situation appropriately. Some argued that I'd fulfilled my civic obligations while maintaining proper professional boundaries. Others suggested that I should have recused myself earlier or found ways to address my family's criminal activity without participating in a federal investigation. The controversy would probably follow me for the rest of my judicial career, but I'd made peace with that consequence. Federal judges are appointed for life precisely because they're expected to make difficult decisions without worrying about popular approval or political consequences. The Constitution protects judicial independence so that judges can do what's legally and morally necessary even when it's personally costly. 3 weeks after the arrests, David and I had the conversation that would determine whether our marriage could survive the revelations of the federal investigation. He'd had time to process his family's criminal activity and my role in exposing it. He'd spoken with counselors and legal experts and family friends who'd offered perspectives on the ethical complexities of our situation. "I've decided that I can't stay married to someone I don't trust," he said. "Not because I think you're a bad person and not because I disagree with your decision to report criminal activity, but because I can't live with someone who's capable of keeping secrets that fundamental for that long." This was devastating but not surprising. Trust is the foundation of marriage, and I'd demonstrated that I could maintain elaborate deceptions for years when I believed the circumstances justified it. Even though my motivations had been honorable, the capacity for that level of deception was incompatible with the kind of intimate partnership that David needed. "I understand," I said, though understanding didn't make it hurt less. "I want you to know that I respect what you did," he continued. "I've read all the evidence and I understand that my family deserved what happened to them. I even agree that you probably couldn't have stopped them any other way. But I can't be married to someone who would do that to people she claimed to love." The word "claimed" was particularly painful because it suggested that David questioned not just my methods but my motivations. That he wondered whether my affection for his family had been genuine or whether I'd been performing emotions to maintain my cover. "My feelings for your family were real," I said. "The love and care and genuine connection pairs that was never fake. What was complicated was figuring out how to balance those feelings with my professional and moral responsibilities." "I believe that," David said. "But it doesn't change the fact that you were able to maintain those relationships while simultaneously working to destroy the people you claim to care about." We separated amicably, though the divorce proceedings were complicated by media attention and the ongoing criminal case. David moved in with friends while he looked for a new apartment. I remained in our townhouse, which felt empty and echoing without his presence. 6 months later, Robert Chen was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Patricia received 8 years for her cooperation with prosecutors. Amanda served 18 months in minimum security and was released to supervised probation. Michael settled with securities regulators and left finance to work for a nonprofit organization focused on environmental remediation. The environmental cleanup continued, funded by asset forfeiture from the Chen family's criminal enterprise. The municipal corruption investigation resulted in convictions for 5 city officials and comprehensive reforms to Phoenix's building inspection processes. The broader construction fraud task force identified and prosecuted 12 other companies that had used similar schemes. A year after the arrests, I hosted a dinner party for the first time since my separation from David. The guests were colleagues from the federal court system, legal aid attorneys, environmental lawyers who'd worked on the Chen case, and Agent Kim, who'd become a close friend during the investigation. We met at a small restaurant in downtown Phoenix, nothing fancy but comfortable and private. The conversation flowed easily between professional topics and personal updates, the kind of gathering where people could be themselves without worrying about social hierarchies or political calculations. During dessert, Agent Kim raised her glass and offered a toast that surprised me with its emotional honesty. To Rachel, she said, who reminded all of us that justice sometimes requires personal sacrifice, and that doing the right thing isn't always compatible with being liked or understood. The other guests joined the toast, but I felt the weight of what had been lost as well as what had been gained. Justice had been served, environmental contamination had been addressed, municipal corruption had been exposed and reformed. But the personal cost had been significant, and there were days when I wondered whether the balance was worth it. Later that evening, I returned home to find an envelope that had been slipped under my door. No return address, but I recognized Patricia Chen's handwriting immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message that I read several times before I fully understood what she was trying to communicate. Judge Martinez, it said, I know you think we deserved what happened to us, and maybe we did, but you sat at our table for 3 years. You smiled at our jokes and helped plan our parties and let us think of you as family. I hope the justice was worth the betrayal, because some things can't be undone. The letter wasn't an apology or an attempt at reconciliation. It was a statement about the permanence of certain choices, about the irreversible nature of broken trust and destroyed relationships. Patricia was serving her sentence in federal prison, but she wanted me to understand that the consequences of my actions extended beyond criminal punishment. I kept the letter in my desk drawer, not as a source of guilt but as a reminder of the complexity of moral choices in situations where every option involves harm to people you care about. Patricia was right that some things can't be undone. Relationships that are broken by fundamental betrayals don't heal just because the betrayal was legally justified. But environmental contamination also can't be undone once chemicals seep into groundwater supplies. Tax fraud also can't be undone once money is stolen from public education and infrastructure. Municipal corruption also can't be undone once democratic institutions are compromised by bribery and systematic fraud. The Chen family's crimes had real victims whose lives were affected in ways that went far beyond their personal relationships with me. Children who might develop health problems from contaminated drinking water. Students who attended schools that were underfunded because of tax evasion. Citizens who lived in communities where building inspections were compromised by corruption. My obligation to those victims had ultimately taken precedence over my loyalty to people who'd welcomed me into their family while simultaneously poisoning their neighbors and stealing from their community. 2 years after the arrests, David remarried. His wife was a teacher who worked at a public elementary school, someone whose values aligned with his desire for honesty and transparency in relationships. They had a small wedding that was covered briefly in local media as a human interest story about rebuilding life after family trauma. I wasn't invited to the wedding, which was appropriate given our history, but I was genuinely happy that David had found someone who could give him the kind of uncomplicated love and trust that he needed. Our marriage had been casualties of circumstances that neither of us had chosen, destroyed by moral complexities that had no clear resolution. The federal courthouse where I work overlooks downtown Phoenix, including the neighborhoods where Chen Development Group built housing developments on contaminated land. The environmental cleanup is ongoing, funded by millions of dollars in seized assets that once paid for country club memberships and European vacations. Every morning when I arrive at Chambers, I can see construction crews working to remediate soil contamination that the Chen family knew about but chose to hide. The work is slow and expensive and will continue for years, but it represents a different kind of justice than criminal prosecution. Environmental restoration, like broken trust, requires patience and persistence and acceptance that some damage takes longer to repair than the time it took to create it. But unlike personal relationships, environmental cleanup is possible with sufficient resources and commitment. The Chen family taught me that some crimes are serious enough to justify betraying personal loyalty. The federal investigation taught me that justice is possible even when it requires sacrificing relationships that you value.
The aftermath taught me that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee personal happiness or moral clarity about the choices you've made. But on mornings when I see those cleanup crews working to repair environmental damage that could have been prevented if the Chen family had followed the law, I remember why the investigation was necessary regardless of its personal cost. Some responsibilities are bigger than individual relationships, some obligations supersede family loyalty. Federal judges are given lifetime appointments not so we can make popular decisions but so we can make necessary decisions without worrying about personal consequences. The Chen case tested that principle in ways I'd never anticipated, but it also confirmed why judicial independence matters in a society where wealth and power often seem immune from accountability. 3 years after treating me like hired help at family gatherings, the Chen family learned that the quiet woman they'd been ordering around had been wielding the full authority of the federal justice system. The servant they'd dismissed as insignificant had been documenting their crimes and building the case that would end their freedom. Justice, as it turned out, had been serving them all along. They just hadn't recognized it until the bill came due. The arraignment hearing for Robert Chen was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in early September, 4 months after the initial arrests. I wasn't presiding over the case, having recused myself from all judicial proceedings
involving the Chen family, but I attended as an observer from the gallery. This wasn't professional curiosity or legal obligation, it was personal closure. The need to witness the formal conclusion of a process that had consumed 3 years of my life and destroyed my marriage. The federal courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and family members of other defendants who'd been swept up in the expanded corruption investigation. Robert Chen sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him. His attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer from San Diego, leaned over frequently to whisper explanations of the proceedings. Patricia was not present, having already pled guilty and begun serving her 8-year sentence at a minimum security federal facility in Colorado. Amanda sat in the front row behind her father, holding Michael's hand and occasionally wiping away tears. She'd completed her own plea agreement and was scheduled to report to federal prison the following month. Judge Morrison read the charges in the formal ceremonial language that transforms human actions into legal categories: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, environmental crimes, tax evasion, money laundering, bribery of public officials. Each count carried potential sentences that, when combined, could result in Robert Chen spending the rest of his life in federal prison. When asked how he pled, Robert Chen stood and spoke 2 words that officially ended the criminal enterprise that had funded 3 decades of luxury lifestyle: not guilty. This wasn't surprising. Robert's defense strategy was to claim that he'd been following standard industry practices and that environmental violations had been the result of contractor negligence rather than deliberate concealment. His attorneys would argue that payments to municipal officials were consulting fees rather than bribes, that tax structures were aggressive but legal, that environmental reports had been prepared by licensed professionals. None of these defenses would succeed, because the evidence was overwhelming, and much of it consisted of Robert's own recorded statements explaining his criminal methods to people he'd assumed were allies. But everyone deserved legal representation and the presumption of innocence, even people who'd spent years poisoning groundwater and bribing inspectors. After the arraignment, I walked through downtown Phoenix toward the federal courthouse, where I'd spent 6 years building a career that now felt fundamentally different than it had before the Chen investigation. The streets were crowded with morning commuters and tourists, people pursuing ordinary lives in a city where they assumed building inspections were honest and construction companies followed environmental regulations. Most of them had no idea how close they'd come to serious harm from systematic municipal corruption, or how many families might have been affected by contaminated groundwater if the Chen Development Group had continued operating without federal intervention. Environmental crimes are often invisible until the damage becomes irreversible, which makes prevention much more important than prosecution.
Back in my chambers, I found a letter that had been forwarded through courthouse security. The return address showed it came from the Federal Correctional Institution in Colorado, where Patricia Chen was serving her sentence. I hesitated before opening it, uncertain whether I wanted to hear from David's mother after 18 months of no communication. The letter was handwritten on standard prison stationery, 3 pages of careful script that must have taken considerable time to compose. Patricia's tone was different than I'd expected. Not angry or accusatory, but reflective and surprisingly thoughtful. "Dear Rachel," it began. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened to our family, and I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. That doesn't mean I forgive you, but I understand." The letter continued with Patricia's account of her gradual realization that the Chen Development Group had been committing serious crimes for years. She'd known about some of the questionable practices, but had convinced herself they were minor ethical violations rather than major federal offenses. She'd participated in money laundering schemes without fully understanding the legal implications. She'd signed false tax returns because Robert had assured her the accounting was aggressive but legal. "I was willfully ignorant," she wrote, "because the lifestyle was too comfortable to question and the alternatives seemed too frightening to consider. I let myself believe that everyone in construction did business the same way, that environmental corners were cut by all developers, that success required a certain amount of ethical flexibility." This was more self-awareness than I'd ever heard Patricia express during the 3 years I'd known her. Federal prison apparently provided opportunities for reflection that weren't available during country club social events and charity fundraising dinners. The most surprising paragraph dealt with Patricia's retrospective understanding of my position during the family gatherings where criminal activity had been discussed openly. "When I think back to those dinner conversations where Robert explained his business methods, I remember how uncomfortable you sometimes looked. I thought you were bored by talk you didn't understand, but now I realize you were processing information about crimes being committed by people you were supposed to care about. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." Patricia was giving me more credit for internal conflict than I probably deserved. While I'd certainly experienced ethical complexity about my role in the investigation, I'd also found professional satisfaction in building a comprehensive case against a criminal organization. The evidence gathering had been methodical and strategic rather than emotionally torturous. But her recognition that I'd been in an impossible position was unexpected and oddly comforting. For 3 years, Patricia had treated me as someone too unsophisticated to understand important conversations or contribute meaningfully to family decisions. Now she understood that I'd been comprehending everything while maintaining careful emotional control. The letter concluded with a paragraph that surprised me with its lack of self-pity and its focus on future consequences rather than past grievances. "Robert will probably die in prison and he deserves to. Amanda's children will grow up knowing their grandfather was a criminal who poisoned other people's drinking water for money. Michael's investment career is over, and he'll spend years paying restitution to clients who trusted him with money he invested in fraudulent projects. David's marriage to you ended because of choices we made long before you entered our family." This was more accountability than I'd expected from someone who'd spent years treating federal regulations as suggestions and environmental protection laws as obstacles to profit maximization. Patricia was acknowledging not just her legal guilt, but her moral responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond her own prison sentence. "I hope someday you'll be able to remember the parts of our family that were genuine," the letter ended, "and understand that not everything we shared with you was performance or manipulation. Some of it was real affection, even if it was complicated by criminal activity we should have ended years before we met you." I read the letter several times before putting it in my desk drawer next to other correspondence related to the Chen case. Patricia's acknowledgement of moral complexity was more nuanced than anything I'd heard from her during family gatherings, but it also raised questions about selective memory and retrospective rationalization.
Had there been genuine affection mixed with criminal activity, or was Patricia rewriting history to make her family's treatment of me seem less exploitative? Had she really been willfully ignorant about environmental crimes, or was she minimizing her own knowledge to reduce her culpability? Was her current self-awareness authentic personal growth, or strategic positioning for early parole consideration? These questions mattered less than the practical reality that the Chen family's criminal enterprise had been dismantled and environmental cleanup was proceeding. Patricia's emotional state and retrospective interpretations didn't change the fact that groundwater contamination had been stopped and municipal corruption had been exposed. But the letter did remind me that criminal prosecutions involve human beings with complex motivations and mixed moral records rather than cartoon villains who commit crimes for purely selfish reasons. The Chen family had genuinely welcomed me into their lives while simultaneously committing serious crimes. They'd shown real care for David while building a business that harmed their community. They'd expressed authentic concern for future generations while poisoning the environment those generations would inherit. This moral complexity didn't excuse their criminal activity, but it explained why the investigation had been personally difficult despite being professionally necessary. I'd been gathering evidence against people who'd included me in holiday celebrations and birthday parties, who'd asked about my career and offered advice about marriage and homeownership. The fact that their advice was often condescending and their inclusion was often conditional didn't change the reality that they'd made space for me in their family while I was working to send them to prison. The betrayal wasn't unidirectional, even though their criminal activity was more serious than my investigative deception. 6 months after receiving Patricia's letter, I encountered Amanda Chen in an unexpected context. I was volunteering at a legal aid clinic that provided free services to low-income families dealing with environmental health issues, many of them related to groundwater contamination in neighborhoods where Chen Development Group had built housing developments. Amanda was there with her 2 young children, seeking legal advice about a civil lawsuit against her father's company. She'd lost her house to asset forfeiture and was living in a small apartment while working part-time at a non-profit organization focused on environmental justice. Her husband Michael had found work at a community college teaching basic finance courses to students who were the first in their families to attend higher education. We looked at each other across the waiting room with the awkward recognition of people who'd once been family but were now connected only by shared history and legal proceedings. Amanda's children, a 4-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son, were playing quietly with donated toys while she filled out intake forms for the legal clinic. "Hello, Rachel," she said when I approached. Her voice was careful and neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. "Hi, Amanda. How are you doing?" This was obviously a complicated question for someone whose father was serving 15 years in federal prison and whose own criminal conviction had resulted in the loss of her house, her social circle, and her previous lifestyle. "We're managing," she said. "The kids are healthy, Michael has work, we have a place to live. It's different than before, but it's honest." The emphasis on honesty was pointed but not accusatory. Amanda understood that her previous lifestyle had been built on criminal activity, and she was making choices that prioritized legal and ethical clarity over financial comfort. "I'm sorry about David," she said quietly. "I know the divorce was hard for both of you." This was more emotional generosity than I'd expected from someone whose life had been destroyed by my role in the federal investigation. Amanda had lost her father to prison, her mother to criminal conviction, her house to asset forfeiture, and her brother to a marriage that couldn't survive the revelation of systematic family deception. "Thank you," I said. "I'm sorry about everything your family went through." "We brought it on ourselves," Amanda replied, matter-of-factly. "Dad made choices that hurt a lot of people, and the rest of us either participated or looked the other way. The consequences were deserved, even if they were painful." This level of accountability was remarkable coming from someone who'd grown up in wealth and privilege, who'd never had to question whether her comfortable lifestyle was ethically justified. Federal prison and asset forfeiture had apparently provided educational experiences that country clubs and private schools hadn't offered. "Are you getting the help you need?" I asked, gesturing toward the legal aid clinic. Yes, there are lawyers here who specialize in civil suits against environmental criminals. Ironic, considering my father was one of the environmental criminals they usually sue. Amanda's ability to find dark humor in her situation suggested emotional resilience that I hadn't observed during her years of privilege and social status. Adversity had apparently revealed strengths that luxury had kept hidden. We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, her work with the environmental justice nonprofit, Michael's transition to education, the children's adaptation to their new circumstances. Amanda was matter-of-fact about the challenges, but optimistic about their ability to build a meaningful life based on honest work rather than criminal proceeds. When her name was called for her legal consultation, she gathered her children and stood to leave. Rachel, she said, pausing at the door to the conference room, I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. It took me a long time to see it, but our family was hurting people, and someone needed to stop us. I'm glad it was someone who knew us well enough to do it thoroughly. This was extraordinary forgiveness from someone who'd had every reason to resent my role in the destruction of her family's criminal enterprise. Amanda had processed the moral complexity of the situation and reached conclusions that prioritized community welfare over family loyalty. Thank you, I said, that means more than you know. After Amanda left with her children, I continued my volunteer work at the legal clinic, helping families seek compensation for health problems caused by groundwater contamination from Chen Development Group construction sites. The work was satisfying in ways that regular judicial duties weren't, because it involved direct service to people who'd been harmed by the criminal activity I'd helped expose. One case involved a family whose 6-year-old daughter had developed respiratory problems after drinking contaminated well water for 2 years. Another involved elderly residents of a mobile home park who'd been exposed to industrial chemicals that Robert Chen had known about but chosen to conceal. A third case involved a young mother whose infant son had been born with birth defects that medical experts linked to environmental toxins from a nearby construction site. These were the real victims of the Chen family's criminal enterprise, people who'd suffered serious harm so that Robert and Patricia could afford country club memberships and European vacations. Their stories reminded me why the federal investigation had been necessary, regardless of the personal cost to my marriage or my relationships with David's family. Environmental crimes often have delayed consequences that don't become apparent until years after the criminal activity has occurred. Children develop learning disabilities from lead exposure. Adults develop cancer from contaminated drinking water. Entire communities suffer health impacts that last for generations. The Chen Development Group's environmental violations would continue harming people for decades, long after Robert completed his federal prison sentence and Patricia was released from custody. The cleanup efforts would mitigate some of the damage, but environmental contamination creates permanent changes that can't be completely reversed. This was why I'd been willing to sacrifice my marriage and destroy my relationship with David's family. The scope of harm caused by their criminal activity extended far beyond financial fraud or tax evasion. They'd poisoned the environment that thousands of families depended on for their health and safety. 2 years after the Chen family arrests, the federal environmental cleanup was nearly complete, funded by $47 million in seized assets from Robert and Patricia's criminal enterprise. The contaminated groundwater had been treated and the soil had been remediated at 6 construction sites across the Phoenix metropolitan area. Municipal reforms had been implemented to prevent future corruption of building inspection processes. New environmental monitoring requirements had been established for all major construction projects. Training programs had been developed to help building inspectors identify and report potential bribery attempts. The broader construction fraud investigation had resulted in criminal charges against 12 other companies and civil settlements totaling over $200 million. Phoenix had become a model for other cities dealing with systematic corruption in municipal government and construction oversight.
These policy changes represented the kind of long-term impact that made the Chen investigation significant beyond the punishment of individual criminals. Environmental protection and municipal integrity were systemic issues that required comprehensive reforms rather than just individual prosecutions. But the personal cost had been substantial and permanent. David and I never reconciled, though we maintained cordial communication about practical matters related to our divorce settlement. He'd found happiness with someone who shared his values about honesty and transparency in relationships. I'd found professional satisfaction in work that directly served communities harmed by the criminal activity I'd helped expose. 3 years after the Chen family treated me like hired help at Amanda's baby shower, I was recognized by the Arizona Environmental Protection Coalition for my role in the largest environmental crime prosecution in state history. The award ceremony was held at the same country club where Amanda's baby shower had taken place, in the same room where Patricia had ordered me around while her husband explained bribery schemes to admiring relatives. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stood at the same podium where Patricia had given toasts about family values and Robert had lectured about business success, accepting recognition for work that had destroyed their criminal enterprise and sent them to federal prison. The award citation read, "For extraordinary service to environmental justice and community protection through federal law enforcement activities that resulted in comprehensive cleanup of groundwater contamination and systematic reform of municipal oversight processes." But the recognition that mattered most came from families who'd been affected by environmental crimes, the parents of children whose health had been protected by groundwater cleanup, the community advocates who'd fought for accountability from developers who'd violated environmental regulations, the municipal employees who could now do their jobs honestly without pressure to ignore violations in exchange for bribes. These people understood that environmental justice sometimes requires personal sacrifice from individuals who have the power and authority to challenge criminal activity. They understood that federal judges, like other public servants, sometimes have to choose between personal relationships and professional obligations. The Chen family had assumed that their money and social connections would protect them from consequences for environmental crimes and municipal corruption. They'd treated federal regulations as suggestions and government employees as inferiors who could be dismissed or manipulated. What they'd learned was that the federal justice system operates according to constitutional principles rather than social hierarchies. That environmental protection laws apply equally to wealthy developers and small contractors. That federal judges derive their authority from legal frameworks that can't be purchased or influenced through country club connections. The woman they'd treated as hired help had been wielding the full power of the federal government all along. The servant they'd ordered around had been documenting their crimes and building the case that would end their freedom and restore environmental integrity to their community. Justice, as it turned out, had been serving them personally while they thought they were being served by someone they considered beneath their notice. The recognition was delayed, but it was comprehensive and permanent. 5 years after the Chen Development Group arrests, I received a final piece of correspondence related to the case. Robert Chen had died in federal prison of heart failure at age 72, having served less than half of his 15-year sentence. His death certificate listed the cause as natural causes, but prison medical records showed that stress and depression had contributed to his declining health. Patricia Chen had been granted compassionate release due to her own health problems and was living in an assisted living facility in Nevada, supported by the small portion of family assets that hadn't been seized by federal authorities. Amanda and Michael had rebuilt their lives around honest work and community service, raising their children in a modest apartment while contributing to environmental justice organizations. David had remarried and started a family of his own, working in cybersecurity for a renewable energy company that specialized in environmental protection technology. We exchanged holiday cards but hadn't spoken directly in over 3 years. The environmental cleanup had been completed successfully, restoring groundwater quality to federal standards and removing soil contamination from 6 construction sites. Long-term monitoring would continue for decades, but communities that had been at risk from chemical exposure were now protected. Municipal reforms had prevented similar corruption schemes and created accountability mechanisms that made bribery more difficult and environmental violations easier to detect. Phoenix had become a national model for cities seeking to address systematic corruption in construction oversight. But the personal relationships that had been destroyed by the federal investigation could not be restored or repaired. Trust that had been broken by years of deception couldn't be rebuilt through legal victories or environmental cleanup. Families that had been torn apart by criminal prosecutions couldn't be reunited through policy reforms or public recognition. The Chen case had taught me that justice sometimes requires sacrificing personal happiness for community welfare. That federal judges must be willing to enforce environmental laws even when the violators are people they care about. That doing the right thing doesn't always result in personal satisfaction or moral clarity. Environmental crimes create harm that lasts for generations, affecting children who haven't been born and communities that don't yet exist. The responsibility to prevent that harm sometimes falls to people who have access to information and authority that others don't possess. Federal judges are appointed for life precisely because they're expected to make difficult decisions without worrying about personal consequences or social approval. The Constitution protects judicial independence so that environmental protection laws can be enforced equally regardless of the wealth or social status of the violators. The Chen family had spent 3 years treating me like their servant, assuming that government employees were less intelligent and less powerful than private business owners. They'd learned that federal authority doesn't depend on social recognition or financial resources, and that environmental justice doesn't make exceptions for people who consider themselves above the law. The woman they'd dismissed as hired help had been serving justice all along, even when they couldn't recognize it. The power they'd underestimated had been constitutional rather than financial, permanent rather than conditional, dedicated to protecting communities rather than accumulating wealth. Sometimes the most effective public servants are the ones who work quietly and patiently, documenting crimes and building cases while maintaining the relationships necessary to gather comprehensive evidence. Sometimes justice comes from people who are willing to be underestimated, who can use their invisibility to observe criminal activity that would be hidden from more obvious forms of law enforcement. The Chen Development Group had operated for years without detection because wealthy criminals are skilled at hiding their activities from traditional oversight. But they'd made the mistake of treating a federal judge like domestic help, assuming that government employees could be safely ignored or condescended to. That mistake had cost them their freedom, their wealth, their social status, and ultimately, their family relationships. But it had protected thousands of people from environmental harm and restored integrity to municipal government processes that affect entire communities. The service had been mutual, though they'd only recognized one direction, they'd received justice, even if they'd interpreted it as punishment. The community had received protection, even if the criminals had experienced it as persecution. And I'd received the satisfaction of knowing that environmental law enforcement could work even in cases involving wealthy defendants with political connections and social influence. That federal judges could fulfill their constitutional obligations even when those obligations conflicted with personal relationships and family loyalty. The Chen family's criminal enterprise was over. The environmental damage had been repaired. The municipal corruption had been eliminated. The victims had been compensated. The community had been protected. Justice had been served in every sense of the phrase. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.